Every one of us, every day, helps create the future. And that's not something that I really think about a hell of a lot, but it is people who study the future, futurists, that's what they think about all the time. They explore the future, they explore the ways of understanding the consequences of choice as we make them today. They argue that it is easier to change the future before it actually happens. And there's a nice quote. Richard Slaughter, who was Australia's first professor of futures from the Swinburne University, says, "The whole point of studying the future is not to predict, but to understand alternatives as a context for making choices. How can we make good choices if we don't know what we're choosing between?" And I think it's safe to say that the people we have in the room today are, the people who embrace corporate social responsibility in their thinking. You have a long-term view of the world. You are driven by long-term goals, not short-term objectives. You are concerned with your existence and the organisation's existence tomorrow, not just a short-term win today. You look to the future with anticipation and a preparedness to adapt to meet an ever-changing economic, social and political climate. Well, our next speaker, we just established that Tim and I actually went to the same university. He was voted person most likely to succeed in public relations, so went into future studies. I was voted person least likely to succeed in public relations, and I've actually been employed for a number of years and supposedly doing all right. Tim is actually project director at the Futurist Foundation, which is a network of Australian futurists. Born in 1980, he's in that sort of interesting time frame where he's one of the babies of Generation X or an elder of Generation Y. And I guess since leaving high school, he tells us that he's been an international debater. Congratulations. He's founded a .com. Yeah. He's been arrested for sneaking into a bar in the back of a beer truck. I like that. He's been taken to Australian Federal Court by Philip Morris. I'd really like that. He studied communications at Charles Sturt University. He and I have debating interests on that one. He studied futures in Australia and in Taiwan. Tim has been invited to speak on the topic of critical choices, how a journey into the future could transform your organisation. So, ladies and gentlemen, the next 40 minutes, let's listen to Tim Longhurst from the Futures Foundation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. And I know Tess described this yesterday as the graveyard shift, and hopefully I'll do this shift just as Tess did yesterday. So thank you very much for coming back and being an audience for me, because obviously the lunch was so delicious. I was a little nervous that I wouldn't have anyone to speak to, but it's great to see those bright eyes and attentive faces, and let's see if I can keep that enthusiasm up for the next, well, I've been told around 28 minutes, and if I can keep it a bit under that, then that would be great. So let's start the clock. And I'll move across to the first slide. What I've done is I've put two images on the board there. I have an image of the Earth, and I'd like to talk about the Earth briefly and my understanding of the choices that are being made now and how that affects our collective futures. And I'd also like to take some time to talk about you. When I was putting this presentation together, I'd like you to note that I did manage to find a picture of the Earth where Australia can be seen, so that took a bit of effort. And when I tried to find an image that would convey this supportive crowd that I have before me, I found a picture of an audience that were applauding. And so I guess that's me creating an ideal future. And I guess in about 25, 28 minutes, we'll see if my ideal future works out for me. So if I talk about briefly my understanding of the world, as was mentioned, I studied communication, and from a very early age I knew I wanted to work in advertising. I wanted to put corporations' best foot forward. I studied communication at Bathurst. My first year out, I went on an overseas trip. I went to the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City. I drove across America with my best friend in an SUV. I lived in New York for 3 months. I travelled through Europe. I came back down through Southeast Asia. And it was when I was on a bus in Thailand, driving along what's referred to as the Diamond Coast, and what should have been pristine fishing villages, but instead was factory upon factory. What should have been blue skies was instead grey skies. And what should have been children having fun and families being together, I got the distinct impression that families were being kept away from each other because of this industrialised model that had been forced upon these people of Thailand. And what really pricked my interest in this is that I suspect that those factories weren't making products that people in Thailand were necessarily consuming. I guess the metaphor that I use is that when I was in North America, I was enjoying the comfort of the SUV, the leather seats, the televisions in the back of the headrests. But when I was in Thailand, I was breathing in the exhaust fumes of the West's behaviour, of the industrialised system. And it was at that point that I started to question my relationship with consumption. I started to question the way that the West consumes. And I started to interrogate some data. I started to do some reading. And I came back to Australia with more questions about the way the world was organised than answers. And there was a very opportune meeting with a guy named Peter Lazar. He's chairman of professional public relations, John's organisation. He's a fantastic communicator. He's a man of integrity. He had spoken to me while I was at university. And it just happened that I went to an event that Peter and his wife Jan were at. And they talked to me about the Futures Foundation. And they talked to me about futures. And they could see that the questions that I was asking were the kind of questions that a futurist would ask. And so they set me on a journey that finds me speaking before you today about the state of our world. When Ray Anderson spoke at the beginning of our conference yesterday, and he outlined the concerns that he feels for the state of the planet, he was speaking to my heart. The concerns that he was describing, one regulatory rollback at a time, one polluted river at a time, and the future, in terms of changing one mind at a time, spoke volumes to me. And seeing the nodding heads in this room, I knew I was in an audience of my peers. And that takes me to talk about you. In the coffee breaks that we've had over the last few days, I've made an attempt to talk with as many of you as I could, so I could get a sense of the audience that I was speaking to. And what I got was a sense that this isn't a group of people who understand the environmental and social challenges that this world faces. This is a group of people who know that there are 6.5 billion people on the planet right now that are consuming at a rate that is overshooting the Earth's ability to sustain life as we know it. This is a group of people who are aware that there are 1.1 billion people in the world without access to clean water, 2.2 without access to basic sanitation. This is a room of people who get it. And this is a room of people who have entered organisations who are prepared to do something about it. They've, at the very least, employed CSR professionals. And I'm honoured to be in a room with you. Today, I'd like to talk to you about futures studies and how the tools and methodologies that futurists use can be put to work to help you achieve your organisation's goals, and better yet, to reshape your organisation's goals to contribute to that just and sustainable world that I know that you're looking for. In terms of future studies, people often ask me, do I have a very clear picture of what the future is? And the simple answer is no. Basically, and I should have turned to this slide a little bit earlier, but I just got carried away. What you'll get out of today's presentation, an understanding of futures, an introduction to some of the tools and methodologies that futurists use, and I hope that you have the confidence to explore futures for your organisation. I believe that if you take the tools and methodologies that I will touch on today back to your organisation, perhaps a zest or an interest in exploring futures, that you will find that some of the greatest challenges that your organisation faces may be addressed in real ways. I was speaking to one of the participants at today's conference. I was talking to him yesterday and he was telling me about how he'd love to see his organisation move to using recycled paper. And he knows that at $5 extra a ream, it's unlikely to happen with the kind of thinking that his organisation has at the moment. And he'd actually set that, I believe, as pretty much his environmental goal for the decade, to see his organisation move to using recycled paper. You and I know that we're not going to address the major environmental and social problems that we face as a global community with recycled paper alone. Your organisations are led by people who are working incredibly hard. They're working faster than any generation has had to work before. They're processing more information than anyone has ever had to process before. They're being driven to work late nights, weekends, deliver quarterly statements to shareholders, to members. We've been talking about what gets measured gets managed. We've been talking about triple bottom line, but for many of you, making that real in the organisation hasn't happened yet. You're on board, but how do you bring your board on board too? Well, I believe that futures studies is one way, and futures methodologies is one way to bring your board on board. And so, toward the end of my presentation, I'll be introducing you to 5 basic tools and techniques that you can carry home to your organisations and make it work for your organisations. The thing is that some of the future is already written. People say that even if we did make significant environmental changes today, that sadly, over the next 30 years, some of those changes won't be recognised. That for the atmosphere, the future is already written in the sky. But that doesn't mean that we don't have options in terms of how the next 60 years look. It doesn't mean that it's not worth seriously engaging with the future. The best news is that to a large degree, the future is a blank canvas. The choices that are made tomorrow have not yet been made. You know that the quality of tomorrow's choices needs to be of a higher calibre than the choices of today and yesterday. And futures will help your organisation rise above the day-to-day challenges that you face and have a look out there at the data on the environment, on data on the community in which your organisations operate. You may find that when you do a futuring exercise with your board, they come across data they're not aware of. Some futurists call futures studies the discomfort zone. It's lifting people out of their comfort zone and introducing them to new territory. And so, as a facilitator, you've got to be brave and you've got to share the confidence in the people that you're working with. Sometimes you'll find yourself working with a group of pharmaceutical experts, medicine experts. I didn't study medicine, who am I to be facilitating a board of doctors and pharmacists? I have confidence that those people can rise above their understanding of day-to-day operations within their markets and make a significant difference and make significant choices about the way their companies operate. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to introduce you to a comparison between wheatgrass and tequila. You can see there on the board a shot of tequila, a shot of wheatgrass. I'm going to be describing what's referred to as living systems theory. For many of you, what you have to offer your organisations in terms of corporate social responsibility, making it real, can be compared to a shot of wheatgrass and a shot of tequila. Now, which of these is poison and which of these is nutrition? Well, it depends what kind of person you are. If you have a look at the athletic person on the left, well, to that person, tequila may be poison and wheatgrass nutrition. But to our friend on the right, it may be the other way around. The kind of person that the fitness freak on your left would like to be sees wheatgrass as nutrition. The kind of person that the gentleman on the right would like to be sees wheatgrass as poison. So how do you see how do you make your worldview within your organisation nutrition and not poison? That's the question that you face. Many of your organisations, we had Ray Anderson yesterday talking about Mount Sustainability, and I'm getting the sense that many of your organisations aren't even aware that Mount Sustainability exists, let alone that there's some organisations that are climbing it. My hope is that you'll change that. I'll talk a little bit about futures now. Often people say, oh, futurists, so you know about the future. But futurists prefer not to talk about the future, singular. We prefer to talk about the future, plural. Futures Foundation. We talk about the future as plural because there are many futures. The future is about choices. There's no one fixed future. The future for you may be different for the future for me. And the future for people in this country is likely to be vastly different to the people of Venezuela, to the people of Thailand, to the people of Taiwan. So there are many futures to be explored in futures studies. And is the future all technology? Of course not. Is the future all new? It isn't. The future comes, and if you look on the icon on your right, the future comes from looking forward, from looking back into history, from looking up, down, and around. The future, or futures, can come from many different places. The Futures Foundation is a network of futurists. We help organisations engage with futures. Now, in terms of being a network of futurists, we have about 50 people who count themselves as full-time practitioners in futures studies. We also currently chair the Australian node of the Millennium Project, which is run through the American Council of the United Nations University. I'll be speaking a little bit about the Millennium Project in a few minutes. We also publish our insights at futuresfoundation.org.au. That web address will also be available at the conclusion of my presentation. So I'll talk to you a little bit about some case studies. I think this is probably this is where the rubber hits the road. This is where futures studies has made a real difference in the past. Now, unfortunately, I can't present you with local, homegrown Australian corporate examples because most of the time when a futurist works within an Australian corporation, they sign a confidentiality agreement. And so I can talk to you today about community examples like Imagine Chicago. 10 years ago, a woman named Bliss Brown, who was an educator, a doctor, and a minister within her church, was living in Chicago and didn't like what she was seeing. She felt that Chicago was not the city that she wanted to raise her children, and she wasn't going to move out, she was going to do something about it. Now, I've had the pleasure to meet Bliss and hear her story firsthand, and I hope that I do it justice. Because what Bliss did is she got together with a group of 16 and 17-year-olds, and she trained them in appreciative inquiry. She taught them investigative skills, how to hold an interview. And she took them to the leaders in the business community, in the community in Chicago, and she had those 16 and 17-year-old young youth of Chicago ask some hard questions, some serious questions about Chicago's future. And what was discovered, to the surprise of the 16 and 17-year-olds, is that these captains of industry, these heads of communication, didn't have a strong idea of what their vision was for Chicago. Even the mayor wanted to talk about past choices and present decisions rather than an overarching vision. And it was through that process, through Imagine Chicago, that a number of community groups were brought together to have a serious discussion about what Chicago should look like, what visions of Chicago might exist. And with a combination of the community, of business leaders, and of youth, Imagine Chicago has celebrated its 10-year anniversary this year and has made significant inroads into literacy, homelessness, and poverty in Chicago. I encourage you to visit the website, Imagine Chicago. I believe it's imaginechicago.com, but your favourite search engine will get you there. Vision 2025 is happening right here in Australia. It's happening in Gosford. I've been proud to be part of it. It started at the beginning of this year, and it involved the Gosford community realising that the Gosford Council realised they didn't have an overarching vision for their community. And they knew that state governments and federal governments in the future would press them to take on infrastructure that they might not approve of, to take on buildings that they're not interested in, salinity plants, provide their water to Sydney. And so what Gosford Council did is involve thousands of their residents in creating a vision of what Gosford could look like in 20 years. By including thousands of people, what Gosford was doing is saying, if we stand for nothing, we will fall for anything. But if we have a strong vision of what we would like Gosford to look like, then we can stand by that. We can stand behind that and actually say to the state government, well, we know you've been thinking about this for a few months, but we've been thinking about this for 6 years. And we've got the community on board and we're following this vision. It's an exciting vision, and again, it's actually available at the Futures Foundation website as a case study. The Community Care Coalition is another recent project. It involves bringing together 25 vastly different domestic care organisations here in Australia and getting them talking about what their shared vision is. And so many of them are pushing so hard with so little resources. We've got Meals on Wheels finding themselves in a position where their volunteers are having to subsidise the price of oil because the subsidies that are provided by Meals on Wheels aren't keeping a pace with the oil price increase. You've got a problem where many of the volunteers of Meals on Wheels are of the age where they should be receiving meals, not delivering them. So this is an organisation that finds itself competing with all sorts of domestic care organisations. So how about they come together and discuss what their compelling vision of the future is? Instead of competing for a 10% increase in petrol subsidies, what about if they put forward to the Australian people a really compelling vision of what the community could look like in the future. And that's exactly the process they're going through right now. And I hope you see the fruits of that in the media in the coming year. So I'm going to now take the time to introduce some Futures tools. To me, this is the most exciting part of the presentation, and I really hope that you get something out of this. I'll be introducing, in order, the Futures Triangle, Emerging Issues Analysis, Causal Layered Analysis, Scenarios, Visioning, and Backcasting. So the Futures Triangle. Basically, as you can see, there are 3 points to the triangle. You can use this triangle right now in your organisation. You can take it back tomorrow and you can talk to your staff about how they see the 3 points on this triangle. It's a simple diagram. It won't take long to copy down. I'll start by describing what the pushes to the future are when it comes to Futures triangles. Basically, the way that the pushes work is you ask yourself, or if you're doing it in a group, ask the group, what do you feel is pushing you into the future? What is it? Is it government regulations changing the way you have to operate? Is it lack of sponsors changing the services that you can provide? Is it increased technology, the demand for a website that you can't deliver, or a website that you don't have the resources to manage? So what are the things that are pushing your organisation into the future? Not necessarily into the future you want either. The second and most exciting point of the triangle is the pull. That's the compelling vision. That's where things start getting fun. If everything went your own way, if the future really was a blank canvas, what would it look like in 20 years? That's called visioning. And it's actually more difficult than you'd think. Often I find myself in a situation where in a 3-day workshop, it's only towards the end of the second day that people really start to feel courageous enough to discuss what they really believe their compelling vision for their industry or their world is. They feel so weighed down by the pushes of the future, what they feel compelled, what they feel like they should be doing, like they shouldn't be at a 3-day workshop, that's for sure. They feel so overwhelmed by the pushes of the future that they don't even have a clue of what the pull might be. And so when they start discussing what the compelling vision is, they start to realise that there is actually something in this organisation that's worth sharing throughout all levels of the organisation. And I should say at this point that Futures Triangle is something that doesn't have to be a top management thing. It can be a process that's applied right through the levels of the organisation, and feedback through to management could be key to the success of this kind of methodology. So, you have your compelling vision, your pull. So what are the weights? The weights are your history, the systems that are already in place, old ways of knowing, old ways of doing things, paradigms that need changing. So, where's the future for your organisation? Well, I can tell you that it's somewhere inside that triangle, but exactly where I can't tell you. If the pushes to the future are too great, then you'll be down in the bottom left-hand corner. If the weights of your organisation, the old ways of thinking, don't shift, then you'll be down in the bottom right-hand corner. But if your vision is compelling enough, so compelling that the pushes aren't strong enough, that the weights are removed, you're unshackled from those weights, then you'll find yourself up towards the top of that triangle, towards the compelling vision that you have for your organisation and that you share with your co-workers and with your stakeholders. Next, I'd like to introduce emerging issues. And I told you I'd bring you in on the Millennium Project briefly. Basically, the way that the Millennium Project works is so far, it's been running for 9 years, and the Millennium Project has so far collected the views and ideas of almost 2,000 academics, business and community leaders from around the world. The Millennium Project asks those people, so, what issues do you feel that the world is facing over the next 20 years? What issues do you feel that we're going to need to address as a community? Well, I could take you through step by step the 15 global challenges, but I'd encourage you to go to the Futures Foundation and read it for yourself. Basically, what you'll find is sustainability is there, and terrorism is there. Access to clean water is there, and so are ethical markets. And by ethical markets, we're talking about removing trade barriers as a possible solution, but there are others. It's a fascinating think tank, the Millennium Project, and the Futures Foundation is proud to chair the Australian node. So that gives you a bit of a taste of what emerging issues could be. But it doesn't have to be a global think tank of 2,000 people. You can ask your own organisation, your members. You can ask your staff. What do they see as the major issues facing their organisation? What systems are playing into what you're seeing in terms of management attitudes? Now, this can be applied not just for your management, of course, but any stakeholder group. You follow that through to worldview. What worldview is being demonstrated here? The most interesting thing in terms of discussion, I think, is the mythical level. That's where you say, what kind of a myth is driving this organisation? Perhaps the myth is that as long as you look after the economy, society and environment will look after itself. Maybe it's, and I'll tell you, I'm working with NGOs, I can tell you that often the myth is that we're the knight in shining armour, and that if we're doing it, it must be good. And that's not always the case. And so having a look at the myths that are driving your organisation can be a really interesting, storytelling has been an important part of human culture for thousands of years. And so bringing a methodology that encourages people to talk and storytell can be really powerful inside organisations. In a complex world, to simplify things into images can be incredibly powerful. I'd finally like to talk about, second last, I'd like to talk about scenarios. Now, scenarios have, I guess the most talked about example of where scenarios has made an impact is in apartheid South Africa. And that's because a group of futurists, actually employed by Shell at the time, went to South Africa to work with a disparate group of stakeholders to discuss South Africa's future, a full 3 years before the end of apartheid. And these disparate groups talked about future scenarios for South Africa. Now, there were a number, but I'll tell you two. One was the ostrich head in the sand attitude. South Africa, business as usual. Now, how's that going to work? A more compelling vision, as it turned out, was the flight of the flamingos scenario. Again, bringing it down to images, breaking it down to a simple story. How do we make the flight of the flamingos scenario a reality for South Africa? Now, this isn't just something that happened at a conference centre and ended at the conference centre. This is something that was published in the two major newspapers of South Africa. This is something that was discussed within organisations that were fighting for South Africa's future, and between organisations that were mediating South Africa's future. So that's how scenarios can work. In terms of visioning, I've touched on that in Futures Triangle, but basically you can discuss in visioning, what's the probable future? Absent intervention, what would the world look like? What's our organisation going to look like? Then you discuss your preferred future, if everything went our way. And of course, in terms of visioning, your possible is going to be somewhere between your probable and your preferred if you put your mind to it. Backcasting, you've set your vision. You've painted the picture of what your ideal future will look like. There's your vision, there's your star. How are we going to go from 2025, which is our vision, all the way back to 2005? Backcast. Paint back the steps, one by one. Who needs to be involved? At what step? What do we need to do? How do we need to change? How can we achieve this great result? And so I'll skip through that, and I'll leave you to continue your Futures journey at either the Futures Foundation website or my own website, which is on the screen. And at the Futures Foundation website, you can sign up to join our organisation and benefit from insights through future news. And at my website, I keep a log of various articles and research that I come across that I think is interesting in terms of the future, in terms of futures for organisations such as yours. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for your time, and congratulations on beating a path for organisations so that one day the externalities can be internalised, so that one day the costs of business can be borne exclusively by business. So congratulations on contributing to a just and sustainable world.
Thank you very much, Tim. Now, Tim's presentation, I know everyone was scribbling down, of course, can be seen, as with all presentations, at csrsummit.com. Now, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes for questions. Now, are microphones ready? Microphones ready. Questions. Let's see if we can get the person's, your name, where you're from, and just a question up to Tim, and we'll see if we can keep this to time.
I must have done a better job than I thought.
Well, Tim, I guess my question is, through initiatives like we've seen today, where is the future placed compared to where it would have been, say, when the time of Wall Street and Gordon Gekko, when you were still in nappies, was made?
I'll confess to have never heard of Gordon Gekko, but I'll try and answer that anyway. I guess, speaking with Jan Lee Martin and Peter Lazar, who founded the Futures Foundation with a group of futurists 10 years ago, I know that it was then that they were talking about triple bottom line. This is not new stuff. But what I also know is that the runs are on the board 10 years later. Organisations are seriously engaging with corporate social responsibility. That's exciting. I know that Jan, for one, who would have loved to have been here as well, but unfortunately couldn't. I know that Jan would love to see triple bottom line. I guess her attitude is basically, I'm over triple bottom line. That's her feeling. I've done triple bottom line. That's old news. What's next? And I think as publisher of Future News, you'll get a real sense of what Jan believes is next. And if she was right about triple bottom line 10 years ago, then I think the insights that she provides today may also be of worth. But in terms of how generally we're placed, look, I don't think there's any doubt we're better placed. The fact that the corporation, which really challenges the corporate model as it stands today, got as much coverage as it did and raised awareness is really exciting to me. And I think it's obviously seeing Ray Anderson speak and seeing, that, like I said, the heads nodding, that's obviously exciting to most of the people in this room. So are there any other questions or do I wrap up?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, we've got one? Just one here.
Yep.
Tim, does your organisation or Futurist do work on sort of societal things? For example, you hear a lot these days about there's terrorism, people are scared, so we tighten up sedition laws, we tighten up police powers, the next people get scared again, so we do the same thing again. And at some point, I guess we come to a breaking point, or I don't know what's going to happen. But do you work on those sort of things as well?
Yeah, I don't personally, but I definitely, I mean, once you start looking at futures research and documents, yeah, you will definitely come across things like, for example, what are the trends of today and what are the counter trends? If the trend is fast food, well, what's the counter trend? And of course, many of you will know that the slow food movement that's come out of Italy is gaining momentum. People saying that actually, I'd like to sit down and enjoy the meal and enjoy my time with family and friends. And so in terms of engaging with those disruptive points in history and potential disruptive points, that's definitely where scenarios comes in, where you start to say, well, are we going to have a business as usual future? Or are, for example, Americans going to take climate change seriously, thanks in no small part to Katrina and Rita? That kind of thing. And so, yeah, that's definitely mapped out in scenarios. And Sohail Inayatullah, who's an Australian futurist of Pakistani origin, explaining his name, who's a wonderful man and a great futurist, does some fantastic scenarios on futures of peace and a whole range of environmental and social issues. So I definitely look that name up, but you can find him through the Futures Foundation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.